All right, we're diving straight into a pretty intense question today. We're going to explore the source material on whether extreme wealth has a dark side. In other words, does having a ton of money actually make you a bad person? Let's get right into it. Our main source starts with this bombshell of a statement. The argument here is that what happened with Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a freak incident, a single monster. Instead, it was the predictable, almost guaranteed outcome of a system that allows for such insane levels of wealth. And that really brings us to the elephant in the room. The Epstein case, with all its truly awful details, is being framed here as a billionaire scandal. And that forces us to ask, are we just looking at a symptom when the real disease is something much, much bigger? So, what's the deal here? Is it just a few bad apples? Or, as our source claims, is there a direct scientific causal link between having extreme wealth and power and doing really harmful things? The argument is that the science is pretty clear on this, so let's actually look at the evidence they present. Okay, so let's get into the first piece of this puzzle, the actual neuroscience. The claim is pretty wild, that having immense power doesn't just change how you live. It literally, physically, rewires your brain. So, to get this, we have to talk about something called mirror neurons. Now, these are a huge part of being human. You know that feeling when you see someone trip and you physically wince? Or you see someone crying and you feel that little pang of sadness? That's your mirror neurons firing. They are basically the brain's hardware for empathy. And this is where the research gets, a little chilling. A study out of McMaster University discovered that when powerful people think about their influence over other people, that core part of their brain, the part responsible for empathy, shows less activity. It literally starts to shut down. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the conflict, right? What our society holds up as the ultimate goal, as success, neuroscience might actually see as a form of brain damage, a literal weakening of our ability to connect with other people. So if power can mess with the brain's empathy circuits, what does that actually look like out in the real world? Well, this brings us to the work of psychologists Paul Piff and Keltner at UC Berkeley, who studied the actual observable behavior of wealthy people. Let's start with a simple question from one of their studies. They just sat and watched drivers at a busy four-way intersection. Now, who do you think was more likely to cut off other cars and just straight up ignore pedestrians in the crosswalk? Yeah, the results were not subtle. The researchers found over and over again that the drivers in luxury cars were way more likely to act unethically on the road. It wasn't an exception. It was a clear and predictable pattern. And if you thought that was something, check this out. In another experiment, they put a jar of candy in a room and told participants it was reserved for children in another lab. The high-income participants took twice as much candy as the lower-income ones. I mean, literally taking candy from a baby. So you have this neurological change and this behavioral change, but that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. People need a way to make sense of their own actions. So how do powerful people rationalize this growing empathy gap? Well, this gets us into the psychology of what you might call moral licensing. Think about it. Nobody sees themselves as the bad guy in their own movie, right? So if your brain is wired to feel less empathy and you find yourself acting more selfishly, what's the story you tell yourself to make all of that feel okay? And for a scientific answer, our source material points us toward a really important academic paper by Michael Kraus and, Keltner again. Their research basically gives us a framework for understanding the stories people build to justify their own status. The first big idea is something called essentialist beliefs. This is basically the idea that social class isn't about luck or the system. It's the view that it's a stable, almost biological trait. The thinking is that rich people are just built different. They're born with the right stuff. And that plugs right into this next idea, the just world hypothesis. This is the deep-seated belief that the world is fundamentally fair and people get what they deserve. So if you're at the top, it's not because you got lucky or the system helped you, it's because you earned it. It's a really powerful way to feel good about your own position. And this quote from the research paper just nails it. These beliefs aren't random. They serve a very specific psychological purpose. They give you a concrete reason for why the way things are is the way they should be, and why it's okay to favor people like you. Now, this might all sound like abstract psychology, but these beliefs have very real and very serious consequences, especially when we start talking about crime and punishment. So the Kraus and Keltner paper draws this really important line between two ideas of justice. On one side, you have retributive justice. Think punishment, prison time, an eye for an eye. On the other side, you have restorative justice, which is all about rehabilitation and fixing the harm that was done. And here it is, the core finding of their work. The higher a person's social rank, the more likely they were to believe in these essentialist ideas, the more they believed the world was fair, and, this is the kicker, the more they rejected rehabilitative justice in favor of harsh, punitive punishments. And that right there provides the scientific backbone for this idea of structural impunity from our first source. See, if you believe the people at the bottom deserve harsh punishment because they're fundamentally flawed, you end up building a justice system that has no real consequences for people at the top, because they see themselves as fundamentally worthy. So when you put it all together, the argument is that a system of extreme inequality creates a two-sided nightmare. On one hand, you get a class of people who are neurologically wired for less empathy. And on the other, you get millions of people made incredibly vulnerable by that exact same system. And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? The focus isn't just on the individual monster. It's about a system that does two things at once. It manufactures the predator, and it creates the economic desperation that brings the victims right to them. And that leaves us with a final, really haunting question from the source material. It reframes the whole problem. Because if you accept this evidence, that the issue is systemic, then chasing down individual monsters isn't the answer. The real question is, how do you shut down the factory that makes them in the first place?